Okay, so as we discussed yesterday that because of this eccentricity, uh, we will have additional forces, that is this spring force will be shifted. If we move to the center of mass, then it will be, obviously you will see that eccentric force. If we move this, then it will be transferred into as a force and then a couple, and because of this couple it would be resisted, I mean this twist would be resisted by additional shears in the columns and that is an additional force. It has, I mean we can actually reduce this force if we can somehow manage to reduce the eccentricity, and that's a very typical uh, problem with earthquake resistant design, and it is all related to the configuration of the structure. This additional force is generated only purely because of the configuration of the structure, because of the how the different structural elements are placed, and if the placement is eccentric or not symmetric, then we are looking at a problem, and this has to be accounted for. If we ignore it, if we somehow fail to ignore this in the design calculations, then we will not be accounting for these additional forces that are coming onto the structure, and the structure is going to fail during an earthquake without doubt, because no amount of factor of safety can compensate for the forces that we have. So what is done normally is, even if in plan, I mean as you all know, every model is wrong. I mean we all do structural analysis based on some models, and every model is wrong. I mean there are all models are based on certain set of assumptions, certain predefined framework, right? So there are limitations for every model, every, no matter what, how sophisticated structural analysis model you make, or how much you have paid for your analysis software, how expensive your analysis software is. Rest assured that the results that you are getting are wrong, but some results can be useful. Some models are useful, they provide you useful information that you can use for your design calculations. You can base your design on the basis of that, with some suitable safety margin built into your design procedure, right? So this safety margin, no amount of this safety margin can accommodate for this additional torsional effects. So what is done in earthquake resistant design code is, even if your model comes out to be, or it looks like a very perfectly symmetric model, everything is very symmetric, but we still account for what we call as accidental eccentricity. So even for oh yes, I have started recording. Even for perfectly symmetric building plans, we make provision for what is called as accidental eccentricity. So what this means is, even if your model predicts that there is no eccentricity, all structural elements are perfectly symmetric and center of stiffness is coincident with center of mass, we still include the additional demand because of accidental eccentricity. Some amount of eccentricity is assumed to be present, which can be because of several other construction practices which cannot be accounted for model, which may lend some kind of eccentric distribution of stiffness or mass in the system, right? So some little provision for eccentricity is always there in the system. So that is a very peculiar thing about earthquake resistant design. Even if your model doesn't show any eccentricity, we still account for some minimum amount of eccentricity in our design calculations, so that some bit element of resistance for additional twist is built into the system, right? So that is one thing. So one important aspect that we have features for earthquake resistant design is the configuration. We need to pay attention to structural configuration. Now what is next? As I said, I hinted at this earthquake resistant design criteria. Structures will sustain damage during design earthquake, right? Because earthquake is a very random phenomena. You can keep on waiting for earthquake even in seismically active zone, and it may never happen. And it may, suddenly you can be jolted by a very strong shock in regions of very low seismicity rate where you do not expect any earthquakes to occur. For example, if you are aware, this Latur earthquake in 1994, something which is considered to be a stable continental shield. Not large earthquakes are likely there, but still we ended up having magnitude 6.5, around 6.5 magnitude earthquake there, and leading to massive destruction of life and property. So and then Himalayas have been quiet for quite some time now, where you do expect large earthquakes to happen. We have had more than 8 plus earthquakes, 8 plus earthquakes in Himalayan belt, historical in last 100 years or so. So this has a potential, Himalayan belt has a potential of generating a very large earthquakes. Small earthquakes keep on happening very frequently, but still no major earthquake has happened after 1999 Chamoli earthquake, right? Except for maybe some 5.8 earthquake in Sikkim a couple of years back. So it is not really commensurate when earthquake occurrence is such a rare thing, such an uncertain thing, and when we are designing a facility whose design life is hardly more than 100 years. Normal buildings 50, 70 years design life, at the most 100 years. So it really doesn't make sense to put in too much of money into something that is so uncertain. On the contrary, gravity load, the dead load, live load, these loads, they are always there. They are day-to-day operational loads, right? So we have to account for all these loads. I mean, because they will be operational during the normal service of the structure, right? Day-to-day service of the structure. Earthquakes may not happen in day-to-day service of the structure. So there is a difference in the loading combination that we have, right? So a dead load, live load will always be there, but on top of that we need to combine it with earthquake load. So what proportion of earthquake load should we take? So some amount of expected level of shaking or whatever earthquake occurrence we can find out, what we call as design basis earthquake. We will find that it is still too high. If I say elastic design for what we call as design basis earthquake, is very expensive. It may render entire project as unviable. It will be so expensive, the buildings will be so expensive that nobody will be able to buy them, nobody will have money to buy those flats or buildings. So in a price sensitive market like India or anywhere in the world, I mean, the costs are going to be so high. If I try to design a building which will resist design basis earthquake without any damage whatsoever, I mean, it will resist, design to withstand all the design basis earthquake effects. I mean, the stress resultants of the column, I mean, the forces in the structural members arising because of the earthquake of intensity which corresponds to the design basis earthquake for that region, it will be very, very expensive proposition, and it may render the entire project as unviable. It will be so expensive that nobody will be willing to put in money in that, and and therefore we need to take an alternative view of that. I mean, considering that earthquakes are very uncertain, it may very well happen that design basis earthquake, I mean, that we are using to calculate the design force may not even happen even once during the design life of the structure. On the other hand, it may happen 3 or 4 times during the design life of the structure, right? So how do you solve this problem? This is a very say, knotty problem. How to find a workable solution? So the workable solution is that we shall design a system such that it will protect life, right? And not necessarily protect investment. Right? So the aim of any earthquake resistant design code is primarily to protect life, that nobody should die during an earthquake if the building has been designed to withstand earthquakes. But no earthquake resistant design code would aim for protection of investment, that is, nothing should happen. I mean, not even a scratch should occur on the structure. Right? So it is not really, the earthquake resistant design codes are not really designed to protect the investment in the structure, rather they are designed to protect life. So are these two terms contradictory? If I am saying that I am not aiming at protection of investment, then how do I claim to protect life? Any ideas?
So we can allow buildings to damage at certain amount so that it will not harm the resident.
Certain amount of damage is not the right way to put it. We would rather say, in a way, we allow buildings to damage in a particular way, in a particular mode. Right? For example, all of you, do you remember plastic analysis mechanism? What is the difference between beam mechanism and portal mechanism? Can you tell me? If I have a building frame, right? So I can talk about hinges developing here, right? So this is what we call as portal mechanism. And on the other hand, we may have a system, same portal, but hinges developing in the beam, right? So this is what we call as beam mechanism. Remember this?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so which one is better? What are the characteristics of these two mechanisms?
Beam mechanism is better.
Beam mechanism is better because it is a local failure, and the structure on its entirely does not lose its load carrying capacity, right? It will still be able to withstand load. So the point is, this is local damage structural integrity is not, I would add this word, some amount of integrity is compromised. It is not severely compromised. And quite often these damages here, they may be repairable and the structure can be put to use again. But in this case, the structural integrity is lost. This is collapse mechanism. The entire structure collapses. It is unable to take any load. it will, it's just unstable. This structure has now become unstable and it will not be able to sustain any further load. So this is the idea, that we try to avoid this kind of global collapse mechanism. The complete structure has collapsed, global collapse mechanism, this has to be avoided, and we encourage this kind of damage to happen. Right? Now there can be, these are all ideal cases, there can be other cases also where one or two plastic hinges are developed here, some hinges are developed in the beam, and some hinges are developed in the column base, and so on. So that is also possible, but still the structure has not turned into a mechanism. It continues to withstand load, it continues to support load to some extent, so that entire structure, I mean, nobody gets, the basic idea is nobody should get crushed under the ceiling during an earthquake, right? So that is what we mean. But when the building sustains such kind of damage, then obviously there is loss of operations. You need to look at, after the earthquake, you need to look at the building, you need to look at the structural system where the damage has happened, and whether the damage is repairable, or you need to evacuate the building and either take down the building or undertake large scale repairs, and so on. So we have not really protected investment. Some more additional expenditure is incurred in order to get the building functional again, but we have been able to, or the idea is, if we encourage, if we ensure that this kind of mechanism is developed during earthquake, during an earthquake, then nobody, or the building inhabitants would be, their lives would be saved. So nobody would die because of an earthquake. So that is what we mean. So how do we achieve this? So this is what we call as life safety. Life safety is the primary goal. So how do we achieve this life safety? Obviously, when I say that I do not design for elastic level, the design basis earthquake, then natural question should arise, how do I design at all? Any damage would indicate non-linear behavior, right? So do you really perform a non-linear analysis for every design? Have you ever performed any non-linear analysis to design a structure?
No, sir.
Yes, sir.
So that's the basic idea. I mean, non-linear analysis is such a complex thing and such an uncertain. I mean, even the analysis is very, very difficult, very, very unreliable. There are so many things that can go wrong during non-linear analysis, and the results are not so easily verifiable, right? So no design office would like to be forced to do a non-linear analysis to come up with a design of a working design of a structure. So all the design codes would primarily aim at working out a linear method of analysis. How to design a structure by using only a linear analysis, which is very easily done, which very quickly done without any large scale computational effort. So a linear analysis is done, and that should give you some idea about how to go about it. So that's how all design codes are, structural design codes are actually framed. They are designed to use a linear analysis. Even the limit state analysis that you use.
Is not visible.
Pardon? Samir, you said something?
Sir, board is not visible, you are saying.
Board is not visible. I am just talking. So I am not writing at the moment. I am just talking to you. So okay. So if you feel comfortable with boards, fine. Let's have the board. So what was I talking? Non-linear analysis. So we don't do nonlinear analysis. So if I have to do a linear analysis, then obviously the question is, if the structure has to undergo sustained damage during design basis earthquake, and I have to actually work out proportions on the basis of a linear analysis, then the obvious corollary is that I need to design the structure for earthquake loads which are much lower than what is specified as a design basis earthquake, right? So I reduce the force levels. Elastic design for reduced level of earthquake loads. So how do I do that? This is, so I would like say EQ is equal to, or design earthquake or earthquake force that I will use in my design calculations is actually some factor. So this is called the reduction factor multiplied by whatever is the design basis earthquake we have. So this is called response. There are different names for that. In IS code we call this factor as a response reduction factor. Right? So we actually, the idea is we actually design for the systems, structural members, for elastic response for the forces that we compute for design basis earthquake, and then scale it down by a factor R, and those forces we include in our calculations for elastic response, linear elastic response of the structural system. Right? So in this process what happens is that annual frequency of accidents, if I go by the statistics, annual frequency of accidents, how many times do I expect these earthquake forces to be exceeded for earthquakes is of the order of 1 to 3%. Is this a large number or a small number? What is your idea?
Sir, actually I didn't get what you mean by like 1 to 3% accident.
If I look 1 year time duration, 1 year time horizon, exposure period, then I would expect that whatever forces I am designing for, these earthquake forces that I am considering in design, I would expect this to be exceeded 1 to 3% in a year. You can consider it as a probability of failure. If you look at the relative frequency interpretation of probability, so this is the probability that the structural response due to an earthquake in that region would be exceeding the forces that you have, earthquake forces that you have accounted for in design, about 1 to 3% of the times. So the probability of if I can say failure connoting that the forces exceed what have been accounted for in the design calculation, so then the probability of that happening in 1 year is of the order of 0.01 to 0.03. So is this a small enough probability, or this is a very large probability?
Sir, very large probability.
Yes, this is a very large probability. I would like to put this in context with what is expected probability of failure for dead loads. Annual frequency of accidents for dead load is of the order of 0.01%. So you get the idea that, resistance for dead load is absolutely critical. The structure will collapse if the dead load resistance is lost. It cannot stand on its own, right? But earthquake resistance is not so critical, provided you play cleverly, right? You play intelligently, then earthquakes can be managed with a much higher probability of accidents, right? And how do we do that? First thing is, in case there is also what we call as energy balance equation. There are energies during vibration. So there is kinetic energy of the stored in the system. There is strain energy or potential energy stored in the system. What should I call it? Strain energy stored in the system. And then there is dissipation energy, energy loss mechanism. So together, these are the capacities, energy capacities. Structural energy capacity. This should be greater than or equal to earthquake input energy. Right? So as long as, there are so many ways. So this is EK and ES. ES is for the elastic strain energy, right? So it's only, elastic strain energy is only one component. I can balance earthquake input energy by suitably increasing the dissipation energy. Now energy dissipation can happen because of non-linear deformations. Inelastic deformation or the plastic deformation in the structural system, right? And that is achieved by two factors. Okay, so first one we have already discussed as the structural configuration. Second one is redundancy. Right? Redundancy in the structural system. What do you mean by redundancy in the structural system? You must be familiar with this. Determinate versus determinate versus indeterminate structures. What is the difference?
So in indeterminate structure, we are not knowing a particular means number of equation is less than the number of unknown, so we consider 1/4 as redundant.
Right. So, so there is a redundancy, and when you have redundancy, then you have additional degrees of freedom or additional load paths, so to say. So, if determinate structure, they are just precariously placed on the boundary of stable and unstable structures. If the capacity exceeds anywhere in the entire structure, it collapses. Right? There is no way you can save a determinate structure if any member capacity is exceeded. Whereas in indeterminate structures, there are several alternate load paths. If one member capacity somewhere exceeds, then the load flow will rearrange itself so that other mechanisms of load transfer are exploited. So it will be some time before the structure approaches the collapse limit. So there are some reserve strength, so to say, in indeterminate structures. So that is first key to earthquake resistant design and construction, that we make use of this reserve strength in the structural system, so that we can provide for the possibility that earthquake forces or the demand due to earthquake may exceed than what has been provided for. Right? And in another thing that we need is related to this redundancy, but not, it goes beyond redundancy. This is ductility. Right? That is again the energy dissipation. You know that I am sure all of you are aware of what is a ductile behavior. What is meant by ductile behavior? Anybody who doesn't understand ductile behavior? ductility of material, ductility. What is the difference between actual?
How much axial and bending deformation the material can have before going into permanent deformation?
Not really bending axial, it is immaterial of the load case, whatever is the load case. So this is deformation, it can be anything, axial deformation or rotation. And okay, so I would rather say strain and stress. So if there is going to be elastic limit, and then there is going to be this plateau before it collapses. So this is the rupture point, ultimate, right? So this is what we call as yield plateau. Longer the yield plateau, more is the capacity to dissipate energy by virtue of non-linear inelastic deformation. That's why we call this as a plastic flow. In case of elastoplastic model, we just call this as a plastic flow. Material will continue to flow plastically in plastic deformation, right? So this actually gives you an idea about how much energy can be absorbed. The stress area under the stress strain curve is the energy that is absorbed by virtue of inelastic deformation. So you can see that how much is the energy. This is the elastic part, this part is elastic strain energy, and this much is what we call as the hysteretic energy because of inelastic deformation. And that is the key to earthquake resistance, which is once in a while earthquake forces, large earthquake forces would be attracted. So if I have a ductile system, then I will be able to absorb the shocks, strong shocks because of earthquake, and withstand the earthquake effects, and come up with what we call as a resilience. Resilient system. So we can recover from earthquake effects quickly, right? So even though we design a system, the forces that we consider for earthquake design, they are very, very small, very, very low for elastic design than what we expect if we compare by the probability of failure or probability of accidents. But then we make up for that by allowing for multiple load paths, by creating redundancy in the structural system, and then the structural system itself is provided enough ductility. So the response reduction factor that we have here, it accounts for several factors. So response reduction factor accounts for overstrength first of all, then redundancy, and then ductility. Right? So we will discuss about all these three issues: overstrength, redundancy, and ductility. Once more, we have discussed about redundancy and ductility to some extent, but next lecture on Thursday we will cover this response reduction and factor and its implication in greater detail. I will stop recording here.